Who likes authority? Even further, who likes submitting to authority? Who has a problem submitting to authority? Who likes running into this guy? It's a sure-found conclusion that authority is everywhere. And for those that had to submit to the authority of my stop sign, I really appreciate that. We really do. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Authority is all around us. Most of us in this room, actually probably all of us in this room, can probably think of some kind of authority that is over them. So last week, we talked about how to love our enemies, correct, right? Now, that may have resonated with some, as some may have come in here with some enemies that they may have had to work through. Some of you it may not have resonated with. I would say hold on to your notes. Time will come, possibly. But today, this would probably impact everyone. This is something that's probably hard for a lot of us to wrap our heads around and to follow. And that's why we're going to talk about this. We could as a church, we could just preach just feel good messages that just pat us on the back, that make us feeling good as we walk out the door. But as you know, we like to preach verse by verse, and we don't skip sections. That's why we don't skip sections like love your enemy. And that's why today we're not going to skip the section where we must submit to authority. So if you are able, please stand with me. We're going to be in Romans 13, 1 through 7. And please follow along as I read. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Let me pray. Dear Lord, just thank you. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the authority that it contains. Thank you for how it points to your authority. And so I pray as we navigate these scriptures and these verses that point us to submitting to the authorities that you have given over us here on earth, I pray that our hearts would be changed in some way or molded in a different way toward those that are in authority. And so I thank you for the challenges that may come and the comfort that may come as we look at these authorities. And thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. So as we look at this passage of submitting to authority, I want to jump right off the gate, right off the bat, and tell you what our main point is going to be throughout this whole thing. And that is going to be submission to authority is not an option. Submission to authority is not an option. We see that right from the very beginning. The first few words of this passage is that every person, this is an all-inclusive list. There's not a person that reads this. There's not a person in the sound of my voice, myself included, that this does not apply to. Now, that being said, of course, God does give us an out from submission to civil authority, if you know. We see this in Acts 5:29. Acts 5:29 says, "But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" So we do see that as far as civil authority, we do see God having, an out, if you will. But if you see it, the principle of submitting to authority is still there, because if you noticed, we're still being obedient and submissive to God's authority. And if you know, this was in context of their desire to share the gospel and being told not to share the gospel and to share the message of Jesus. And so be careful how you want to use this idea of obedience over God, or obedience to God over man. It's really about biblical things. And so we need to be careful as we navigate those things. So now, as I was thinking of this idea of authority, I was thinking there is some laws, and so I wanted to read some laws that I'm not sure why they're in existence, but the top 15, if you will, like laws in certain states that maybe are different all across the board. So first is, it is illegal to send a surprise pizza delivery to someone's house in Louisiana. In Alaska, it's illegal to wake a sleeping bear to take a photo. It is unlawful to sell, dispose of, give away, or use stink funk bombs in Alabama. In Arizona, you could face legal recourse if you let your donkey sleep in a bathtub. It's illegal to cry on the witness stand during any state case in Los Angeles. Billboards are illegal in Hawaii, Alaska, Maine, and Vermont. In Kentucky, lawyers, legislators, and public officers are required by law to take an oath promising that they have never fought in a duel with a deadly weapon. It's illegal to throw stones in the District of Columbia. Spiteful gossip or talking behind someone's back is illegal in Indiana. Fortune telling is against the law in Baltimore, Maryland. Scaring a pigeon is illegal in Massachusetts. It's illegal to fall asleep while lying down in a cheese factory in South Dakota. It's against the law for 4 or more women who aren't related to rent a house or apartment together in Missouri. In New York, it's illegal to throw a ball at someone's head for giggles. Running out of gas in Youngstown, Ohio is illegal and can earn you a ticket. So I'm not sure the reason behind some of these laws that have been made. I'm sure whoever had them passed at one point, I'm sure there was a good reason why they had it. And when I thought of this even further, I thought of parents. Usually, when a parent tells their kid to do something, what is their typical, when the kid says why, what is the typical response? Because I said so. Now, the beauty of God is, he could have just said, let everyone be subject to authority. He could have just ended it there. It's God, because I said so, right? The beauty of this passage is what we're going to see 4 reasons why we should be submitting to authority. And so, as we look, let's see what our first reason is why we should obey authority. And we see that in the first 2 verses, and it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." And so we see from there, what I have is authority is from God. Authority is from God. We see that right off the bat, that this was something that God instituted, something that God made for man. Man didn't come up with the idea of authority, because I'm assuming if we had, we probably would have not decided that. So we need to understand that this isn't a man-made idea. This is God-made. He created this for us, and that is a reason in itself for us to submit to authority. And so as we see, we're going to see 3 things from this passage that point us to the reason, really, about God and his institution of authority. And we see, as we look at the first verse, we see, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And so my question is, what is the those that Paul is referring to? Is he referring to the people, or is he referring to the position of authority? And I've got the position. He is referring to the position. And that's my first point for A. And that is, God instituted the position of authority. The position of authority. And that's important for us to understand, because people come and go, but positions of authority are established. That's what he has established. And we see that from the very beginning. Exodus 20, verse 12 says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." So we see right from the beginning, one of the 10 Commandments, foundationally, is obedience and honor to our parents. The position of parents, not specifically, even within that, who? It's the father and your mother. John Calvin writes, "Wherefore it ought not to be doubted that God here lays down a universal rule for conduct, namely, that to everyone whom we know to be placed in authority over us by his appointment, we should render reverence, obedience, gratitude, and all the other services in our power. Nor does it make any difference whether they are worthy of this honor or not." And that's an important element that we need to understand. It's not the person. We are honoring the position. Even in this regard, we're honoring the parents. It's not whether we like who the father is, whether we like who the mother is in that situation. It is honor the mother and father. And we see that. And that's important as we continue to look. So point B is going to be, it is about the position and not the person. It is about the position and not the person. And we can kind of see this as we think of who Paul was speaking of when he was talking about authority. And then let's look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. It says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil, and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor." There's a significance behind what Peter has just said. And even what we've just read, what Paul has read about subject to authority. Who was the emperor during the time of Paul and Peter? Nero. Was he a great guy? Was he worth following? What was going on during this time, especially for Christians? Persecution. And so Peter specifically claims the emperor. He says, honor the emperor. Not the emperor to come, like he was hoping maybe somebody was going to take his place that would be better than Nero. It's honor the emperor, the person that was currently in that position, because it's about the position, not the person. And so we see that very clearly here. And then last point we see, as we see verse 2 says, we see whoever resists the authorities resist what God has appointed. So we need to understand, our point number C would be resisting governing authorities is resisting God's authority. Resisting governing authorities is resisting God's authority. And that's important. That's why we have to understand that it's authority from God, because when we are resistant to those governing authorities that are around us, it's really not them that we're resisting. It's really God that we're resisting. Ephesians 5:21 says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Out of reverence for who? For Christ. This is about our reverence to Christ more than it is to even just the person that we're submitting to. John MacArthur writes, here Paul stated unequivocally that every spirit-filled Christian is to be a humble, submissive Christian, This is foundational to all the relationships in this section. No believer is inherently superior to any other believer. And they're standing before God, all believers are equal in every way. Because if you know the rest after Ephesians 5, he starts talking about husbands and wives. And really, amazingly, he sets this all up by the submission that we should all be having for one another. And being that we're pointing that submission to Christ. So let's look at another reason why Paul would tell us that we need to submit to authority. And we can find that in verse 3. It says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval." So what I've got for reason number 2 is authority is for the good of man. Authority is for the good of man. This is for our good. That's the beauty and blessing of what God has established for us. It's for our good. A lot of times we don't see it that way because we look and see who's maybe in position, all those things. But we need to remember the good that is coming from this. And we see that by 2 things. And we see, first, we see from verse 3, it says, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct. And so what we see is submission brings good conduct. And we could see that Titus 3:1 says, "Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work." For every good work. The submission to the authorities around us is in some ways preparing us for the good that God would have us do. Timothy Keller writes, "Paul is saying that governments are needed to hold people accountable to live in a way that makes it possible to live together. Without the threat of punishment, human self-interest would make society impossible. So the very system of human government is a wise one." And I can't help but think, as I think of this idea of authority producing good, I can't help but think of driving. When I'm driving, sometimes I like to go the speed limit. My wife would say that's not always true, especially when she's in the car, but she regulates that very well. But I was thinking of even further. We were on a trip, and she pointed out, hey, this is an area where there's usually a speed trap. What she was saying is this is the area specifically where I want you to go the speed limit. And that's what I did, because I understood that I didn't want to get caught speeding, especially with my wife in the car. And so there was good produced as I was obeying the speed. I was going the speed limit because of the authority that I was ultimately in fear of, but I didn't have to be afraid of them. As I looked at the speed limit, I'm good to go, right? And so I think that rule applies very well there. And so verse 3, as we continue and we look at that again, it says, there's things it says would have no fear, and then it says down, then do what is good. And so resistance, on the other hand, brings fear. Resistance brings fear. And we can kind of see this as we see the beginnings of retribution and authority, as Genesis 9:6 says, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." And then Exodus 21:23 through 25 also says, "But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." And so what we see is we see retribution for those things that we do. This isn't writing saying, hey, in the regards of someone who say, you take my hand, I could take your hand. This is a fearful thing that, man, if I take someone else's hand, I'm liable to lose my own hand, or life for that matter. And so there is retribution. There is punishment that comes when we disobey. And so that brings fear with us. When we understand, when we don't follow what God or what the authorities have given us to do, there's usually a repercussion for disobeying a law that has been made. And so there needs to be understanding on that. So let's see our third reason. Verse 4 says, "For he is God's servant for your good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." So he is an avenger. He is an avenger for God. He is God's servant. And so what I've got for you for point number 3 is authority is for God's vengeance. Authority is for God's vengeance. And I love that he's put this in there because if you remember what we talked about last week, part of the points from Romans 12:19, if you remember, says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." Part of his vengeance that we can hold true and trust in is through civil government and acting for us and having that retribution and punishment when things are done wrong against us. Tony Merida writes, "The reason we can avoid vengeance is not only because God will execute perfect justice in the future, but also because God has appointed government as the institution to carry out judgment in the present age." They are the ones that can mediate those things for us. You know, the courts and the police and all those things that are instituted to help us in those situations where we need them. And I can't help but think of, as a parent, I can't help but think how many times my children come to me and run up to me and say, "Hey, so-and-so is doing this or that. Why are they asking me? Why are they telling me these things?" Because they want me to enact some kind of discipline or punishment on their behalf to help them. They want me, in certain regards, to be the vengeance one for them. And that is what God is using our civil governments as well. And so we see that. So lastly, reason number 4, there it says in verse 5, it says, "Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience." What is Paul saying when he writes this? What I have here is authority is for spiritual peace. Authority is for spiritual peace. There is a peace that we can have when we obey. Not only the good that we are enacting because of the good stuff that we're doing in obedience, but just the peace that we can have because we're being obedient. Isaiah 26:3 says, "You keep in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you." When we trust and we are obedient to God, and within that we are obedient to the civil government, there's peace that God gives us. I can't think of, at the end of our day, when we lay our heads on our pillow, or even at the end of our life when we look back, we can have peace when we look back and say, I've been obedient. I've been obedient to the authorities that are over me. I've been obedient to those. On an application, on most applications that you fill out, what is one of the questions that's typically asked? Usually they ask whether it be any speeding violations or, traffic violations, or whether you have, had any, been imprisoned or anything of that nature. And so it's peaceful to be able to fill those applications out and have a peaceful to write, whatever it is that you've done well, you've done good, and they have nothing to look back on you for. And so there's peace there. And so that is important for us to remember and understand. So as a way of review, main point, if you get nothing else, submission to authority is not an option. Submission to authority is not an option. And remember, ultimately our submission is to God's authority. So no matter what, we're obedient to him. And so we also saw 4 reasons. We saw 4 reasons why. And we saw the first one was authority is from God. He's the one who instituted these authorities, all the ones that we have. And so within that, we saw God instituted positions of authority. He created that. We saw that from just the parent model and so forth. Also, it is about the position and not the person. It's about the position and not the person. If you can, remember who was in charge and authority when Paul and Peter was writing this. It should help us to remember as we think of who's in our authority that we definitely need to listen and obey, considering what they were writing. And then resisting governing authorities is resisting God's authority. We need to remember ultimately that we are being resistant to God and not just those that are around us. Second reason, authority is for the good of man. Authority is for the good of man. It's for our good. It doesn't matter who's up on authority, and we may not like them, may not think they're the greatest, but at the end of the day, these positions and these authorities that are over us, it's for our good. And we saw that because submission brings good conduct. They bring good things for us. Obedience on our part. We can obey the laws. And we also saw that resistance brings fear. When we are not being submitful, it brings fear as opposed to the good. And we shouldn't want that. Third reason is authority is for God's vengeance. That vengeance that we are wanting to have, we have the authorities to help with those things. And God has instituted those on our behalf to help with those. And then lastly, authority is for spiritual peace. There's peace that we can have as we are submitting to civil governing authorities. And within that, submitting to God's authority. So we should have peace there. So lastly, as we wrap up the last two verses, let me read them again. It says, "For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." And so lastly, as we look at these last two verses, he's really given us a how-to to submit to these authorities. What can we do in response? And I've got submission to authority comes with responsibility. Submission to authority comes with responsibility. There's things that we can do and have to do in response to this submission. He lists a few of them here. He lists, paying taxes. He talks about, honoring, respecting those that are over us. And so we see this modeled with Jesus amazingly. Mark 12:17 says, Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they marveled at him. So he's saying, he's talking about this, this idea of paying taxes. And he's saying, hey, give to Caesar what is deserved and owed to him. And so he even acts this out. Later on, you see in Matthew 17:24-27 says, "When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, 'Does your teacher not pay the tax?' He said, 'Yes.' And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, 'What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?' And when he said, 'From others,' Jesus said to him, 'Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself.'" So here we see Jesus following his own rule and what he has said, and he is paying his tax in that. And so the beauty of Jesus, even as I was thinking, as he's sitting in the garden, he really shows obedience to authority as he says, for it is by your will and not mine, speaking to the Father. And he was about to go and be obedient and submissive to the civil government as he offered himself and went to the cross. And so may we not miss his submission to authority and the thankfulness that he did submit to that authority on the behalf of us all. And so, that might create some change in us, that we might have to make some changes. I've said a couple times to a few people, I might now have to start parking in my driveway now as opposed to on my grass in front of my house. There's things that we might have to start doing in regards to the authorities that are over us, because that is submitting ultimately to what God wants us to do. Let me pray. Dear Lord, just thank you. Thank you for